Before we get into this one, let me ask you something. If you ruled an entire empire, if billions of people bowed when you walked into a room, would you ever pour coffee for someone else with your own hands? Most rulers in fiction don't. They get served. That's the whole point of being a queen. So when you hear a title like this one, your brain should be asking the same thing I asked when I first wrote it down. What kind of man makes an empress forget she's an empress? Stick around because the answer isn't what you think, and it definitely isn't romance novel fluff. This one earns it. Captain Eli Mercer had 11 minutes of oxygen left, and he was doing math in his head to make the dying feel productive. The transport ship Holloway had taken a direct hit 4 hours ago, somewhere past the edge of mapped space, in a system that didn't even have a name yet, just a designation number nobody would remember. The hit had cracked the hull along the spine, and Eli had spent those 4 hours doing the only thing that made sense to a man trained for crisis. He sealed bulkheads. He rerouted air. He got 6 crew members into the last working pod and watched it launch without him because there hadn't been a 7th seat. Now he was alone in a dying ship, breathing recycled air that tasted like metal and old coffee, watching a number on a cracked screen count down toward 0. He didn't pray. He'd never been the praying type. Instead, he thought about his sister back on Earth, about a promise he'd made her at 14 that he'd come home from every deployment, and about how he was apparently about to become the first lie he'd ever told her. The number on the screen hit 4 minutes. He closed his eyes. The ship didn't explode. It got swallowed. There's no better word for what happened. The hull groaned. Light bent strangely through the cracked viewport, and Eli felt his stomach drop the way it does on a fast elevator. Except the elevator didn't stop for almost a full minute. When it did stop, the ship wasn't drifting in dead space anymore. It was sitting, intact somehow, inside what looked like a hangar built from black glass and gold light, big enough to swallow 10 ships like his. He didn't have time to process the geometry of the place before the ship's remaining systems screamed a final warning and shut down completely, plunging him into total darkness except for the glow bleeding in from outside the hull. His oxygen alarm had stopped counting because there was, technically, nothing left to count toward. He grabbed the emergency breather, the one with maybe 90 seconds in the tank, and forced the manual hatch release with his shoulder until it gave. He didn't have a plan. He had a body that refused to stop moving even when the brain attached to it had quietly accepted the math wasn't going to work out. What waited outside the hatch wasn't a rescue crew. It was silence first, then a presence, the kind you feel on the back of your neck before you see it. Eli turned, breather hissing weakly against his face, and found himself looking up at a woman who stood at least 7 feet tall, draped in fabric that moved like it was woven from something closer to smoke than thread. Her skin held a faint internal light, gold under the surface like a coal bed that hadn't gone out. Her eyes were the kind of color humans don't really have a word for, somewhere between amber and storm gray, and they were studying him with an intensity that made his skin feel transparent. Behind her stood maybe 20 more figures, armored, silent, weapons lowered but ready. Nobody moved to help him. Nobody moved to kill him either. They just watched, the way you'd watch something unexpected wash up on a beach. His breather gave its last hiss and started feeding him nothing. Eli did the only thing his training had ever actually prepared him for. He stayed calm, dropped the empty breather, and raised both hands slowly, even as his lungs began screaming for air that apparently didn't exist in whatever room he'd just been pulled into. The tall woman tilted her head, the gold light under her skin pulsing once like a held breath. Then she said something in a language that hit his ears as pure sound and somehow unfolded into meaning a half-second later, the way thunder arrives after lightning. He is suffocating. It wasn't a question. It was almost an accusation, aimed at the air itself for daring to be inhospitable to a guest. She raised one hand and the room around Eli shifted. He felt pressure change against his skin, felt something that smelled faintly of ozone and rain settle into his lungs where there had only been the threat of nothing. He gasped, real air this time, and his vision swam with relief and disbelief in equal measure. "There," she said, stepping closer. "Now you will not die in my hall like a dropped piece of fruit." It should have been a strange thing to say. It should have made him laugh, if laughing hadn't felt so dangerously close to crying. Eli straightened his spine instead, because even half dead and completely out of his depth, some habits don't switch off. "Thank you," he managed. Voice cracked from the thin air he'd been breathing for the last hour of his life. "I'd say I'm sorry for the mess, but I didn't exactly plan on crashing into your home." For a moment, nobody around them moved. Then something shifted behind those amber storm eyes. Something that looked almost like surprise. Nobody had thanked her for anything in longer than she could remember. Her name, once it unfolded properly in his mind the way her first words had, was Sarael. Not a name so much as a title that had calcified into one over centuries. The kind of name that stopped being a name and started being a weight the moment she was crowned. She was First Light of the Veyn Dominion, and the empire her people governed didn't measure itself in planets. It measured itself in entire star clusters, dozens of them, all answering to a throne that hadn't seen a true successor in longer than human civilization had existed. Eli learned all of this slowly, in pieces, over the next several days, mostly because nobody bothered explaining it to him directly. They simply assumed he'd understand the way water understands gravity. He didn't. He was a transport captain from a species these people had apparently catalogued and dismissed centuries ago as promising but unfinished. And now he was sitting in a guest chamber the size of a small airport, trying to figure out why he hadn't been executed, studied, or both. The room they'd given him had no door he could find, just a wall that simply stopped existing when someone approached from the other side and reappeared once they'd passed through. The first time it happened, Eli nearly threw a chair at it out of pure, startled instinct. The second time, he just sighed and accepted that physics here ran on different rules, and nobody was going to walk him through the user manual. Sarael visited on the third day. She didn't send a guard, didn't announce herself with ceremony. The wall simply opened and she stepped through alone, which Eli would later learn was its own kind of statement, because empresses of the Veyn Dominion did not go anywhere alone. Ever. There was always a retinue, always at minimum 2 wardens flanking her, a small moving fortress of protocol that existed specifically to make sure nothing unplanned ever got near her. She came in carrying 2 cups. He almost missed the strangeness of it at first, because his brain was too busy cataloging the room's measurements and exit options, the way it had been trained to do in any unfamiliar space. It took him a solid 5 seconds to register that the 7-foot gold-veined ruler of several hundred star systems was holding 2 cups of something steaming, and that she'd apparently made them herself, because there was a faint singe mark on her sleeve like she'd stood too close to whatever passed for a stove in this place. "It is called Sail Fen," she said, setting 1 cup down in front of him without ceremony, the way someone sets down a drink for a friend rather than a prisoner. "Your biology should tolerate it. I had it tested." Eli looked at the cup, then at her, then back at the cup. "You tested a drink, on me, before I got here." "I tested several." She sat across from him, which was its own small earthquake because the chair she chose wasn't elevated, wasn't a throne, was just a chair, the same height as his. "Most would have killed you. This one will not." "That's reassuring," he said, and meant it mostly. He took a sip anyway because refusing felt rude, and it tasted faintly like coffee crossed with something smokier, something almost like the smell after rain on hot pavement. It wasn't bad. It wasn't anything he'd order again on purpose, but it wasn't bad. "You did not run," she said, watching him drink. Not a question again. She seemed to favor statements over questions, the way people do when they're used to being right. "Wasn't anywhere to run to. Your hallway doesn't have doors I can find." "That is not what I meant." Her amber-gray eyes held something unreadable, something old. "When you woke in my hall, suffocating, surrounded by my wardens, you did not run. You did not beg. You thanked me." Eli set the cup down slowly. "Would running have helped?" "No." "Then there's your answer. I don't waste energy on things that don't help." He paused, then added quieter. "Also, you saved my life about 4 seconds before I figured out how to die in a way that wouldn't have looked very dignified. Seemed worth a thank you." Something in her face shifted again, that same flicker of surprise from the hangar. Except this time it lingered a half-second longer before she smoothed it away. What Eli didn't know yet, what he wouldn't learn for weeks, was that Sarael had ruled the Dominion for 340 years. In that time, every single person who had ever sat across from her, every advisor, every suitor offered up by desperate noble houses hoping to bind their bloodline to hers, every ambassador from every conquered or allied system, had done exactly one thing without exception. They had served her first. It wasn't even something they thought about. It was instinct, drilled into every culture under Veyn rule across a dozen generations. You did not let the first light pour her own drink. You did not let her carry her own weight. You anticipated her comfort before she had to ask for it, because asking would have meant admitting she had needs like anyone else. And an Empress was not supposed to have needs like anyone else. She had not poured her own drink in over a century. She genuinely could not remember the last time someone had simply let her sit there and exist without managing her. And this half-drowned, sunburned stranger from a species her own scholars considered barely past their evolutionary infancy had just thanked her for saving his life like she was a stranger who'd helped him change a flat tire, and then implied, gently, that he found her hospitality merely adequate rather than divine. It should have insulted her. Her wardens outside the chamber would have called it insulting, would have wanted his tongue for the disrespect. Instead, something in her chest, somewhere underneath 3 centuries of armor she'd built without ever choosing to build it, loosened by a fraction so small she almost didn't notice it happening. "Tell me about your sister," she said suddenly, and Eli blinked because he hadn't mentioned having one. Not out loud, not to her. "How did you said her name in your sleep, the first night. Sarah." Sarael's voice had gone quieter, almost careful. "You promised her something. I do not understand the context, but the promise mattered to you. I could feel it even without understanding the words." Eli stared at her for a long moment. This woman who ruled more space than he could comprehend, who'd apparently sat in the dark listening to him talk in his sleep instead of having someone else monitor him, the way protocol surely demanded. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked. "You're an Empress. You've got an entire empire's worth of problems. Why are you sitting in my room asking about my sister?" Sarael looked down at her own cup, the steam curling up past that faint internal glow under her skin, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked less like a ruler and more like someone working up the nerve to say something true. "Because," she said finally, "no one has asked me a real question in 112 years, and I find that I would very much like to remember what it feels like to answer one." Word travels fast in a court built on 3 centuries of careful watching, and by the 5th day, everyone in the upper chambers of the Veyn Palace knew that the first light had been seen carrying her own drinks down the east corridor. Twice. Nobody said anything to her directly. Nobody would have dared. But Eli started noticing the looks, the way conversations stopped half a beat too late when he walked past, the way the guards stationed outside his open-walled room watched him with something that had shifted from suspicion into something closer to calculation. He found out why on the 6th day, when a man who introduced himself as Tovrin, second voice of the Dominion Council, requested an audience with him in a tone that made it clear requested was a courtesy and not an option. Tovrin was older, silver-veined instead of gold, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of being the second most powerful person in a room and making peace with it. He didn't sit. He stood at the far end of Eli's chamber with his hands folded and studied him the way you'd study a stain you weren't sure would come out of the carpet. "You should know what you are doing," Tovrin said without preamble. "I'm drinking something called Sailfen and trying not to think too hard about how I got here," Eli said. "If there's a more specific answer you're looking for, you'll have to be more specific. The First Light has not personally served a guest in over a century. She has not sat at eye level with anyone outside the royal bloodline in longer than that. She has not, to my knowledge, asked a personal question of anyone since before I was born." Tovrin's voice stayed flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like fear wearing the mask of formality. "And in 6 days, you have undone all of it." Eli leaned back. "I haven't done anything. I drank some coffee. I answered some questions. That's it." "That is precisely the problem." Tovrin finally moved, crossing the room slowly, the way you'd approach something that might bite. "You do not understand what she is. The Veyn throne does not simply rule, Captain. It holds. It is the only thing standing between 41 star systems and the kind of chaos that ended 3 empires before ours. The First Light cannot afford to be a person. She has to be a function, a constant. The moment she becomes something softer than that, in the eyes of her own court, In the eyes of every noble house circling that throne for 3 centuries waiting for a single crack to exploit, she becomes vulnerable. So what, I'm supposed to ignore her? Treat her like furniture because that's safer for everyone? I am saying, Tovrin said, his voice finally cracking just slightly at the edges, that I have served her for 60 years. I watched her bury 2 siblings to assassination before she ever sat the throne. I watched her marry a stranger at 19 for an alliance that fell apart within a decade anyway. I watched her stop crying in front of other people sometime around her 40th year, because crying in front of people was a luxury that got reported back to enemies as weakness. And in 6 days, you have made her laugh twice. I have not heard that woman laugh in 11 years, Captain Mercer. 11 years. The room went quiet, except for the faint hum of whatever powered the walls. Eli sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere he hadn't expected. I'm not trying to hurt her, he said finally. I didn't know any of this. Nobody's exactly handed me a manual. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway that didn't exist until he needed it to. There is a selection coming, he said, without turning around. In 11 days, every ruling house in the Dominion will gather to formally propose new alliance bonds for the First Light, the way they have every decade since her coronation. It is ceremony. It is politics. It has never once been about what she wants. He finally looked back at Eli, and his old eyes carried something heavier than warning now. Be careful what you start, Captain. The court does not forgive things it cannot control. And right now, you are the single most uncontrolled variable this throne has had in 300 years. He left. The wall sealed shut behind him without a sound. Eli sat alone in the silence for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over in his head, trying to fit it against the woman who'd sat across from him 3 nights running, asking about Earth, about his sister, about why humans built things that could break instead of things that lasted forever like Veyn architecture. She hadn't asked like a ruler gathering intelligence. She'd asked like someone starving for something she didn't have a name for yet. He found her that evening on a balcony that overlooked something he still didn't have words for. A horizon made of 3 moons, and a sky the color of a bruise healing, beautiful in a way that made his chest hurt a little. She was alone, which he now understood was its own quiet rebellion. No wardens, no retinue, just her and the wind pulling at fabric that moved like smoke. Tovrin spoke to you, she said, not turning around. Of course she already knew. He's worried about you. He has been worried about me since I was 19 years old. A faint, tired smile touched the edge of her voice. It is, I think, the only way he knows how to love anyone, through worry. Eli came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough to talk quietly, not close enough to crowd her. He told me about the selection. In 11 days, she was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, just full of things she hadn't decided how to say yet. Every 10 years, she said finally, they bring me a list. Names, bloodlines, strategic value measured in resources and territory and old grudges I am meant to settle through marriage. I have done this 4 times already. 4 husbands, 4 alliances, 4 small deaths I agreed to because the Dominion needed the peace more than I needed to feel like a person. She finally turned to look at him, and there was something raw in her amber storm eyes that hadn't been there 6 days ago. I had stopped expecting it to feel like anything else, and then you crashed into my hangar, half suffocated, and thanked me instead of demanding I save your life as though it was owed to you. Sarael, I am not finished. Her voice wavered, just barely, just enough that he heard 3 centuries of careful control straining against something underneath it. I do not know what to do with the way I feel when you simply look at me like I am a woman and not a war you are trying to survive. It terrifies me more than any enemy fleet ever has. Because enemy fleets, Eli Mercer, I know exactly how to fight. The wind pulled at both of them in the silence that followed, and somewhere far below the palace, in chambers full of old men and older grudges, the machinery of the selection had already begun turning. 11 days from a verdict neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could stop. The attack came on the 9th day, 2 days before the selection, and it didn't come from outside the palace walls the way Eli expected danger to come. It came from inside, dressed in ceremony. He'd been given more freedom by then, enough to walk the lower gardens without an escort breathing down his neck. And he was crossing through a courtyard of plants that glowed faintly blue in the dimming light, when 3 figures stepped out from behind a row of stone pillars. They wore the dark green sashes he'd learned belonged to House Veyn, one of the oldest noble bloodlines in the Dominion, the kind of family that measured its grudges in centuries instead of years. Captain Mercer. The one in front was young, sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that never once touched his eyes. "We've heard so much about you," the court's new curiosity. "Funny, nobody's introduced me to House Veyn yet." Eli kept his hands loose at his sides, kept his weight balanced. 15 years of training didn't switch off just because the threat wore silk instead of armor. Should I be flattered or worried? Worried, mostly. The young noble circled him slowly, the way predators circle when they've already decided the outcome and are only enjoying the delay. "You don't understand the position you've put her in. The First Light has spent 3 centuries being untouchable, unshakable, the single fixed point this Dominion organizes itself around. And in 9 days, you've made her into something the court whispers about at dinner. Something soft. Something they think they can finally get a grip on. That's not on me. That's on people deciding to gossip instead of mind their own business." "You misunderstand," the smile sharpened. "I am not angry at you for what you've done to her reputation, Captain. I am here because House Veyn has waited 4 generations for the selection to land in our favor, and you are currently the single largest obstacle standing in our way. The First Light has been distracted, soft, asking questions instead of making the decisions our bloodline has been promised for 40 years. "I know." Tovern's shoulders dropped, just slightly, the first unguarded thing he'd done since walking in. "That is what worries me more than anything else. If you were scheming, I would know how to handle you. I have handled schemers for 60 years. But you are simply being decent to her, and decency is the one weapon this court has never developed a defense against." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway that didn't exist until he needed it to. "There is a selection coming," he said without turning around. "In 11 days, every ruling house in the Dominion will gather to formally propose new alliance bonds for the First Light, the way they have every decade since her coronation. It is ceremony. It is politics. It has never once been about what she wants." He finally looked back at Eli, and his old eyes carried something heavier than warning now. "Be careful what you start, Captain. The court does not forgive things it cannot control. And right now, you are the single most uncontrolled variable this throne has had in 300 years. He left. The wall sealed shut behind him without a sound. Eli sat alone in the silence for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over in his head, trying to fit it against the woman who'd sat across from him 3 nights running, asking about Earth, about his sister, about why humans built things that could break instead of things that lasted forever like Veyn architecture. She hadn't asked like a ruler gathering intelligence. She'd asked like someone starving for something she didn't have a name for yet. He found her that evening on a balcony that overlooked something he still didn't have words for. A horizon made of 3 moons, and a sky the color of a bruise healing, beautiful in a way that made his chest hurt a little. She was alone, which he now understood was its own quiet rebellion. No wardens, no retinue, just her and the wind pulling at fabric that moved like smoke. "Tovern spoke to you," she said, not turning around. Of course she already knew. "He's worried about you. He has been worried about me since I was 19 years old." A faint, tired smile touched the edge of her voice. "It is, I think, the only way he knows how to love anyone, through worry." Eli came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough to talk quietly, not close enough to crowd her. "He told me about the selection. In 11 days, she was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, just full of things she hadn't decided how to say yet. "Every 10 years, she said finally, they bring me a list. Names, bloodlines, strategic value measured in resources and territory and old grudges I am meant to settle through marriage. I have done this 4 times already. 4 husbands, 4 alliances, 4 small deaths I agreed to because the Dominion needed the peace more than I needed to feel like a person." She finally turned to look at him, and there was something raw in her amber storm eyes that hadn't been there 6 days ago. "I had stopped expecting it to feel like anything else, and then you crashed into my hangar, half suffocated, and thanked me instead of demanding I save your life as though it was owed to you. Sarael, I am not finished. Her voice wavered, just barely. Just enough that he heard 3 centuries of careful control straining against something underneath it. I do not know what to do with the way I feel when you simply look at me like I am a woman and not a war you are trying to survive. It terrifies me more than any enemy fleet ever has. Because enemy fleets, Eli Mercer, I know exactly how to fight. The wind pulled at both of them in the silence that followed, and somewhere far below the palace, in chambers full of old men and older grudges, the machinery of the selection had already begun turning. 11 days from a verdict neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could stop. The attack came on the 9th day, 2 days before the selection, and it didn't come from outside the palace walls the way Eli expected danger to come. It came from inside, dressed in ceremony. He'd been given more freedom by then, enough to walk the lower gardens without an escort breathing down his neck, and he was crossing through a courtyard of plants that glowed faintly blue in the dimming light, when 3 figures stepped out from behind a row of stone pillars. They wore the dark green sashes he'd learned belonged to House Veyn, one of the oldest noble bloodlines in the Dominion, the kind of family that measured its grudges in centuries instead of years. Captain Mercer. The one in front was young, sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that never once touched his eyes. We've heard so much about you, the court's new curiosity. Funny, nobody's introduced me to House Veyn yet. Eli kept his hands loose at his sides, kept his weight balanced. 15 years of training didn't switch off just because the threat wore silk instead of armor. Should I be flattered or worried? Worried, mostly. The young noble circled him slowly, the way predators circle when they've already decided the outcome and are only enjoying the delay. You don't understand the position you've put her in. The First Light has spent 3 centuries being untouchable, unshakable, the single fixed point this Dominion organizes itself around. And in 9 days, you've made her into something the court whispers about at dinner. Something soft. Something they think they can finally get a grip on. That's not on me. That's on people deciding to gossip instead of mind their own business. You misunderstand. The smile sharpened. I am not angry at you for what you've done to her reputation, Captain. I am here because House Veyn has waited 4 generations for the selection to land in our favor, and you are currently the single largest obstacle standing in our way. The First Light has been distracted, soft, asking questions instead of making the decisions our bloodline has been promised for 40 years. The 2 behind him moved at the same moment the noble's hand dropped to something at his belt, and Eli's body reacted before his mind finished processing the threat. 15 years of combat training rising up faster than conscious thought. He sidestepped the first grab, used the noble's own momentum to put him into the nearest pillar hard enough to knock the air out of him, and turned just in time to catch the second attacker's wrist before the blade in it found his ribs. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of fight people wrote songs about. It was ugly, close, desperate, the kind of fighting Eli had actually been trained for, the kind that didn't care about honor or ceremony, only about who walked away breathing. He took a cut along his forearm that burned like fire, and put the second attacker down with an elbow that connected wrong enough to break something. The third ran before Eli could turn on him, disappearing back through the pillars the way he'd come. The young noble, Veyn's son, lay against the stone where Eli had put him, gasping, glaring up with pure venom in eyes that had stopped pretending to smile. "This isn't finished," he managed. "It is for tonight," Eli said, breathing hard, pressing his good hand against the cut on his arm. "Tell your father something for me. If he wants a war, he should send people who actually know how to fight one." Sarael found him 12 minutes later, alerted by a warden who'd heard the commotion, and the look on her face when she saw the blood soaking through his sleeve was something Eli hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful composure of a ruler, not even the cautious warmth that had been growing between them for 9 days. Something closer to raw panic, barely contained. "You are hurt." Her hands were on his arm before he could protest, gold light flaring under her skin as she pressed her palm against the wound, and he felt warmth spread through it that had nothing to do with the bleeding and everything to do with whatever strange biology let her people heal things that human medicine would have needed stitches for. "I'm fine. 3 of Veyn's people jumped me in the garden. I've had worse." "You should not have had this at all." Her voice shook just slightly. The careful control she'd spent 3 centuries building cracking down the middle. This is my fault. I let myself become careless. I let the court see what you mean to me, and now they believe hurting you is the same as hurting the throne itself. Sarael. He caught her hand before she could pull away, the wound already closed beneath her touch, just an angry red line now instead of an open cut. Look at me. This isn't your fault. People decided to do something ugly because they're scared of losing power. That's on them, not you. You do not understand what I am risking. Her amber storm eyes were bright, too bright, and for the first time since the hangar, since the breather running out, since all of it, Eli watched an Empress of 41 star systems look genuinely afraid of something that wasn't an invading fleet. In 2 days, the selection happens. The court will present alliances I am expected to accept, the way I have 4 times before. And if I refuse them, if I do what I am beginning to want to do, which is choose something that was never on any list they prepared for me, they will not simply gossip about it. They will see it as proof that I have become weak enough to challenge. House Veyn already tried to remove the obstacle quietly tonight. If I give them a real reason, they will not stay quiet next time. Then don't choose anything yet. Eli kept his voice steady, kept his hand wrapped around hers, even though every instinct told him she could probably break every bone in it without trying. Get through the selection. Figure out the politics. I'm not asking you to blow up 300 years of careful balance for me. I just want you safe. Something in her face shifted at that, soft and sharp at the same time, like she was hearing something she'd waited a very long time for and almost couldn't believe now that it had arrived. In 112 years, she said quietly, no one has ever once told me what they wanted for me, rather than from me. Her free hand came up to rest against his chest, right over the steady drum of his heartbeat, the same way she had with the cup 6 nights ago, simple, unguarded, real. You ask for nothing, Eli Mercer, not territory, not title, not even safety for yourself, only for me. I do not know what to do with a man who wants nothing from me except for me to remain whole. Maybe that's the whole point, he said softly. Maybe nobody's supposed to want anything from you. Maybe you're allowed to just be a person who happens to also run an empire. Outside, beyond the glowing courtyard, the first lights of the gathering nobility were already beginning to arrive for the selection. Banners of 41 houses rising over the palace walls, every single one of them believing they understood exactly how the next 2 days would unfold. None of them had accounted for a transport captain who'd crashed into a hangar with 11 minutes of air left and somehow, without meaning to, become the one thing in 3 centuries the First Light refused to let go of. The Hall of Selection had not changed its shape in 3 centuries. 41 banners hung from a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow, and the floor was carved from the same black glass as the hangar where Eli had first arrived, polished smooth by generations of nobles walking forward to offer their sons, their daughters, their alliances, like pieces being moved across a board they all pretended was bigger than it actually was. Eli stood at the back of the hall, dressed in clothes Sarael's staff had quietly provided, not as a guest exactly, not as anything official, just present. The way Tovrin had arranged after a long and careful conversation about optics that Eli hadn't fully understood and hadn't needed to. He watched house after house step forward. He watched silver-haired patriarchs present sons with resumes instead of personalities, watched matriarchs in jeweled collars speak about territory and grain shipments and old debts, as though they were love letters. Sarael sat the throne through all of it, spine straight, face composed into the same careful stillness Eli now understood had taken her 300 years to perfect. But he could see what nobody else in that hall could see anymore. The faint tension at the corner of her mouth. The way her hands, folded in her lap, gripped just slightly too tight. House Veyn went last, by old tradition reserved for the bloodline with the strongest claim. The patriarch, an older version of the young man Eli had put into a pillar 4 nights earlier, stepped forward with a confidence that bordered on entitlement. "First Light," he said, voice carrying easily across the hall. "For 4 generations, House Veyn has waited for the alliance promised to us by your grandmother's own decree. We offer my second son, trained in your service since birth, ready to take his place at your side and finally honor a debt 40 years overdue. The hall went quiet. The particular quiet of several hundred people pretending they didn't already know the answer while desperately wanting to hear it anyway. Sarael rose from the throne. She didn't rise the way Eli had seen rulers rise in old films, slow and theatrical. She rose like someone who'd finally made a decision after carrying its weight for far too long, and just wanted it done. "House Veyn," she said, and her voice filled the hall without effort, the same way it had in the hangar 9 days ago. "I am aware of the debt my grandmother promised. I am also aware that 4 nights ago, 3 members of your household attacked an unarmed visitor under my protection in my own gardens, because that visitor had become inconvenient to your ambitions." The patriarch's face went through several colors in rapid succession. "First Light, I assure you, those men acted without They acted exactly as your house has always acted when it believed power was slipping from its grasp." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I have spent 300 years keeping peace between 41 houses by being predictable, by being a function rather than a person. I have married 4 times for alliances this court demanded, and I have buried siblings to the kind of ambition that just tried to bleed a man in my garden for the crime of being kind to me." She stepped down from the throne, and the entire hall seemed to lean forward at once. "I am done being predictable." Whispers broke out across the hall like a wave, and Tovrin, standing near the front with his hands folded, didn't move, didn't react, though Eli could see something in the old man's posture that looked almost like relief, breaking through 60 years of careful worry. "I will not accept House Veyn's offer," Sarael said. "I will not accept any offer presented today, because every offer on this floor measures me in territory and bloodline and old debts, and none of them once asked what I might actually want for myself in 300 years of rule." Her eyes swept the hall, and then found Eli at the back, standing very still, very aware that several hundred of the most powerful people in the Dominion had just turned to follow her gaze. "I want to choose. For the first time since I was crowned, I want the right to choose something that was never on anyone's list." "This is not how the selection works," the Veyn patriarch said, his voice rising with something close to panic now. "There are protocols, First Light. Centuries of precedent. Centuries of precedent also said an Empress could not pour her own coffee," Sarael said. And for just a moment, just a flicker, something almost like a smile crossed her face. "I have learned recently that precedent bends more easily than people assume, if someone is simply willing to be the first to bend it." She crossed the hall floor, every step echoing off black glass, and stopped in front of Eli, close enough now that the entire court could see exactly what this meant, exactly what she was choosing in front of 41 houses who had spent 400 years believing the throne belonged to politics and never once to a person. "You once asked me why I served you coffee with my own hands," she said quietly, just for him, though the hall was silent enough that everyone heard it anyway. "I think I finally have an answer worth giving you in front of all of them. I'm listening. Because for 112 years, every person who entered my life wanted something from the throne. You walked into my hall suffocating, with nothing left to offer anyone, and the first thing you did was thank me. You have never once asked what the crown could give you. You only ever asked if I was all right." Her hand found his, the same way it had on that balcony, simple and unguarded. "I served you coffee, Eli Mercer, because for the first time in longer than I can properly remember, someone made me want to be a person again before I had to be a queen." The hall erupted into noise. 41 houses arguing, objecting, some even applauding. The great machinery of 3 centuries of careful political balance finally cracking open into something nobody in that room had a protocol for. House Veyn stormed out in fury. Other houses lingered, watching, recalculating, already wondering how to survive in a dominion where the First Light had just proven she could not be managed after all. None of it mattered to Eli in that moment. He was still a transport captain who'd crashed into a hangar with 11 minutes of air left, who'd never asked to become anyone's reason for rewriting 300 years of tradition. But he looked at the woman standing in front of him, gold light steady and warm under her skin instead of guarded, and understood that some promises get made without ever saying the words out loud. In the weeks that followed, the Dominion didn't collapse the way House Veyn had warned it would. It simply changed shape, slowly, the way empires do when one person at the very top finally stops performing strength and starts actually living inside it. New alliances formed, old grudges cooled, and somewhere in the upper chambers of a palace built from black glass and gold light, a cup of sail fen sat every morning on a table built for two, poured by hands that no longer needed protocol to remind them they were allowed to care about someone. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, do us a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you'd want to see next, and subscribe to HFY Soundscape so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more stories like this one coming, and honestly, we'd love to have you stick around for them.